Be strong.
Professor Enrollment solemnly declared after careful consideration. The professor has captured a monster and will bring it to the students to practice in combat. This bold idea of Professor Enrollment made Li Han extremely shocked. Li Han silently complained in his heart, was this the professor's move wrong? The professor should have thought of a way to make sure no monsters came here. But contrary to Li Han's thoughts, the student next to him seemed to excitedly agree with this idea. The rest of the students also responded, saying that it would be impossible to defeat the monster if they faltered due to fear, and that a true knight must know how to face his fear. Professor Enrollment happily looked at the excitement of the students. He was moved and said, if there are people who object, I will still think twice. You are indeed talented swordsmen, so your thoughts are very different. He turned to look forward to Wardanez's answer. Li Han reflexively agreed with everyone, even praising it as a great idea. As soon as the words were spoken, Li Han covered his mouth in regret, silently blaming himself for reflexively saying the wrong thing. In the end, Li Han could only rush after Javelin, and Professor Enrollment happily praised everyone. The most dramatic part has come. Professor Enrollment decided to divide the group into groups of 3 by drawing lots. Everyone with the same number will be on the same team. And as a result, Li Han drew number 4. Drugu's lottery ticket coincidentally also said the number 4. What's more surprising is that Giselle is also number 4. So the unfortunate fate pushed 3 people, Li Han, Drugu and Giselle, into group 4. Li Han began to blame himself for being too naive, too many people, and yet he got stuck with this group. Giselle smiled contemptuously and secretly thanked her. Thanks to Wardanez, she has been very happy in the past, since that day. Li Han remembered that last time he accidentally drugged them and made them faint. He sighed to gain courage. Li Han stood up to explain that his previous actions were childish and hoped everyone would forget those things. But maybe Giselle didn't agree. He snorted and asked, what, forget it? Giselle angrily left and thought that Li Han's words were silly. Drugu saw that things didn't look very good and turned to ask if Li Han was really serious. Drugu said that because they were both from the north, they understood Giselle's personality very well. He was an endlessly vindictive person. Drugu somewhat sincerely told Li Han to be careful because Giselle would get in the way. He even offered to protect Li Han, while Li Han whispered that the upcoming group would be very tired. Professor Enrollment's order to assemble rang out. The students voluntarily gathered, then the professor announced something new. To facilitate the selection of group leaders, the professor prepared something special for the students. He held up a lottery sheet on the form and pointed to the red dot. Whoever had the red dot on the paper would become the group leader and would be the one to command the rest of the people who would have to follow and fight the monsters. Seeing that he had to elect the group leader in this unique way, Li Han felt a bit uneasy. Looking at his blank piece of paper with only the number 4 again, he felt even more uncomfortable. In the end, Li Han put all his faith in Drugu's last hope, but he apologized. It's really gone. Both of them looked at the remaining Giselle member in panic. Then I saw Giselle arrogantly holding up her piece of paper with a red dot. Giselle also emphasized that she will be the leader of the group. Giselle. Li Han helplessly called the group leader but was retorted by Giselle. The word Giselle was not there. Li Han had no choice but to obey and call the group leader Giselle. At that time, Li Han was like a machine, continuously calling team leader Giselle until he nodded in satisfaction and then stopped. Then Li Han said with a fake smile, but it was actually a threat, hoping he would give instructions if he didn't want to be stabbed in the back. Giselle also responded with a smile but secretly scoffed, I look forward to working with you, subordinate number 1. The two of them continuously praised each other. Li Han was looking forward to the fighting techniques of the north and Giselle replied sarcastically, afraid that Li Han wouldn't be able to keep up. No one noticed Drugu standing to the side watching, silently sweating. There is a great saying that knights who have witnessed a blizzard in the northern mountains will no longer be afraid of anything. Drugu is also one of them. But looking at the two people standing in front of him fighting with each other, Drugu was really scared of the current situation. Another practitioner raised his hand to speak. He ran to ask the professor about the monster the whole class was about to confront. The rest also listened quietly. But Professor Enrollment could only answer without revealing anything, making the student a little surprised. The professor smiled kindly and explained that in order to fight the unknown monsters of the future, the students must learn how to fight without any information about them. Hearing that, Li Han and Giselle's faces immediately darkened as if they couldn't believe it, and even had a bit of contempt. You brought up the professor's irresponsible opinion, so what can the professor pay attention to? The black-haired male student cheered when he heard that. Turning back, he saw that everyone was determined to complete the task his teacher assigned him well, and would show him the honor of a knight. When Li Han heard this, he denied it because this was a magic school. Giselle saw the frustration and immediately cursed the idiots. He just turned to look at her for a moment and she scolded him. But you just see that we have the same thoughts. She dismissed it as nonsense, because everything he did was following her orders, but he responded as long as her orders were reasonable. She smirked and asked again, "Didn't you make us feign and then hand it over to the professor?" But he reassured them that they were on the same side, but she angrily told him not to say anything more. Durgu here consoled that there were some misunderstandings that could no longer be explained. But he did not accept it and blamed Durgu for having a talent for irritating others. One by one each group entered, monsters waited inside, each group used their own way to run. The three of them, Durgu, Li Han and Giselle, walked forward together. Li Han bravely opened the door. He slowly walked inside. And even he had to admit that it was still pitch dark inside at noon, probably simulating an encounter with a monster. Suddenly Li Han held wooden sticks and lit them. A stream of light covers this place. Giselle on this side also looked impressed. She hesitated to think because this energy source was a strengthening drug. All three were excited. Suddenly one of the monster's feet stepped on the floor. It looks like a bull covered in diamonds, growling face with scary eyes. Giselle asked if it was the bull from before, but he denied it was not. And there was a loud sound. That energy is like a strengthening drug. Remember what the professor said, don't say it's a cow. But Li Han still firmly said it was not so. Durgu felt bad and asked him what was wrong. And he knew he should focus on the situation at hand. Because he felt two different types of energy from it, the enhancement drug and the spirit. Durgu started to get confused and didn't know what to do. Giselle found it easy to see and easy to analyze. Li Han then explained that normal attacks were ineffective and asked the two friends if they could infuse mana into their weapons. And all three said in unison that they could. Giselle on this side angrily wondered where he came from the Night Clan and how he did this. Then she spoke to Durgu and asked him in the center position, who would stand in the most dangerous place. Standing directly in front of the bull would easily attack, she kept saying, ignoring Li Han standing next to him. He asked Durgu to tell Giselle that the center position was naturally taken by the captain, causing him to suddenly include Li Han as well. Then she slowly teased Durgu by raising her middle finger. And these two feel like children. The three decided on a game of rock paper scissors, a while later. Every single step. It was Li Han who came forward. He was sad because it ended up like that. Simple strategy, we will split into three different sides and slowly approach until it reacts. The targeted person will focus on dodging, the remaining two will attack. The problem was the person dodging the attack, and he felt that it would only make the person doing the decoy more tired. Without waiting any longer, the bull moved forward with its head. It growled and screamed, looking very ferocious. Start casting your magic spells. Not only did Giselle become deaf, but also Durgu. When fighting, Li Han felt like this one wouldn't be easy to defeat. If so, then instead approach it. Then he asked to listen to the flow order. Holding a sword in one hand and a wooden stick in the other, he looked so serious and fiercely majestic. But on this side, the bulls are no less. Its eyes began to glow, baring its teeth. Just looking at it was terrifying. Durgu also couldn't believe it, as expected of Li Han. But there was something that made him cry out in alarm. Looking at the direction the water bridge was pointing at the bull, Giselle could guess somewhat. Giselle stood still and saw that all the water bridges were facing the bull. The wand appeared billowing with mana waters that were still sustaining them. Li Han's face was expressionless, he just calmly performed his magic. Seeing Li Han act like that, Giselle was extremely upset and angry and scolded Li Han for this name. An idea had previously come up when she chose a position for each person, after seeing Li Han talking to Durgu. Giselle wanted to lure the bull towards Wodana's, causing her to smirk smugly. However, as always, Giselle thought that Li Han had the same plan as her. Not to be outdone, Giselle rushed forward because for her there was no way she could not defeat her. Giselle stood behind Li Han, surprising him, thinking that she had caused him difficulties. She was even more pleased. However, every move she made was discovered by him. Li Han deployed magic to hide in the darkness, leaving behind a rushing stream of water. Giselle was startled. She did not expect that he would disappear. At the same time, the bull approached her while she wasn't paying attention. Giselle didn't expect it to come so close. If you throw a javelin, you must follow the climb. Giselle makes a move to turn the bull into gold. The first wooden sword grazed the bull's neck, causing it to clench its teeth and a bright color spurted out strongly. After being attacked by Giselle, the bull's body cracked further, revealing the bright color of mana. Being attacked, the bull turned and ran away out of control. Spots of light appeared on its body. Giselle stood still and watched it run away. Looking at the wound on the knife and the bull's current situation, Giselle expressed regret because the wound was too shallow. After a while, the bull recovered and returned to its original aggressive state, exhaling white smoke. Without hesitation, Giselle decided to rush forward because she knew that she had no other choice but to block the attack. Giselle's entire body emitted a burning golden aura, her hand tightly grasping the wooden sword in her hand. Giselle started to challenge and pointed her sword at the bull, and if you said, well, come here, she will want to destroy it. But unfortunately, Li Han was quicker. His sword forcefully appeared on the bull's head. Li Han decided to end the fight. He relied on his seasoned technique to hit it hard. The bull resisted, but it was insignificant. The only thing left was to stand still and absorb the blade. The bull looked blankly and didn't even understand what was going on. The swing of the sword caused the bull to fly far away, its whole body floating in the air and then landing on the ground. Giselle lowered her sword next to Durgu, who was also standing motionless, looking at the motionless bull. Giz stood looking at the bull with a bewildered expression. Even Durgu was scared to the point of sweating at the scene before his eyes. Li Han's voice spoke and he appeared in the light, truly a special person who always knows how to make an impression. Seeing Li Han appear holding a wooden sword made Giselle surprised. The wooden sword disappeared in Li Han's hand, making him a bit sad, but he had predicted that after pouring a lot of mana into it. Durgu couldn't help but be curious why Li Han turned the bull yellow with just one fatal blow. Looking towards the bull, Li Han advised Durgu to ignore it because he realized it was about to wake up. Li Han spoke up and asked everyone to take this opportunity to run out of the dungeon, and Durgu also cooperated and ran. Durgu was scared. His mind couldn't stop eating because the pressure was so much that he didn't dare look back. Knowing that she was dealt a painful blow, Giselle was angry and didn't expect you to dare to take advantage of me again. You watch out for me. The three of them hurriedly ran away. Durgu had some doubts about whether this was okay, but Li Han was definitely okay. Because the team disbanded after this class anyway. Loud screams rang out. The students ran frantically out of the base, everyone's faces filled with fear. The students sat panting outside the corner of the wall. Everyone's faces were ashen as the rest of the class. Everyone was in a daze because they had just passed through death's door. Seeing the last group running out, Li Han thought the class was over. At that moment, Professor Enrollment appeared and asked the students to gather. Looking at Professor Li Han, he felt a bit confused. Li Han wondered how the group could defeat the monster by channeling mana into their swords, but how the other groups could overcome the bull. Professor Enrollment mentioned the recent competition. He meant to mention that there was a group that wanted to defeat the bull, which made him a bit surprised. When Li Han and group heard it, it was as if they had been hit in the heart. Li Han thought back that the mission was just to escape, but he didn't think he would especially praise his team for defeating it. This move was unpredictable. The whole class began to discuss who would defeat the bull. Among them Giselle was mentioned as a candidate. Giselle standing next to her shivered when she heard it. They had already overestimated her a bit. Professor Enrollment wanted to know the students' assessments of the monster. All the answers he received were that it was strong and immune to attacks. Professor Enrollment was not surprised to hear that. He even comforted the students, but Li Han's group turned pale. He said that after this successful escape, the students will realize there is no reason for us to be afraid. Students must face their fears if they want to overcome them, and this is also true of swordsmanship. He hopes that the students will always calmly analyze the enemy. If they cannot win, then running away is the best policy, and he also knows that the students will learn their own lessons. Durgu sadly nodded in agreement. Professor Enrollment suddenly remembered the problem. Enrollment announced that he would keep the group intact until the end of the semester, making Durgu want to turn to stone after hearing it. Durgu turned around in panic. He was still in doubt and couldn't believe his ears. Even Giselle and Li Han were shocked. Their faces darkened. The three of them looked at each other awkwardly. This move was extremely uncomfortable. Now that the three of them are stuck together until the end of the term, Lee Han wants to reconnect with the old love, so he asks Durgyu if he should apologize for what happened in the past, but Durgyu only hopes that he will be a bridge between the two sides for safety. Moving to the dream hall of the alchemy class, two students appeared. Yoner waved his hands and said he was ready for class. On the contrary, Nelia looked at her blankly. Yoner looked curiously at Lee Han's seat. She wondered why he hadn't come to class yet, so she was a bit disappointed. Just at that moment, Yoner saw Lee Han appear. The atmosphere was a bit tense when Lee Han was walked closely by two students. Yoner wondered why he was being escorted like a criminal. Lee Han quickly explained that it was because they came after his class ended and wanted to protect you, that's why. Then the two students hastily said that everywhere outside the Dragon Tower was a battlefield, so they would protect Lee Han. Originally, the Dragon Tower and the White Tiger Tower were not close to each other and had attempted assassination, but Lee Han was in the same group as them, so protecting Lee Han was urgent for them. Yoner sighed and mentioned that Lee Han was stronger than the two students combined. How could he protect her? However, there was an opinion that contradicted her. Sister Sienna meant that their situation was very dangerous. When Lee Han met Sister Sienna, he was extremely excited. Lee Han even praised her as an alchemy master and greeted her. Sister Sienna then gave Lee Han the magic potion she made to defeat monsters, so I hope he tries it. Lee Han appreciates this sincerity. Seeing Lee Han acting so freely, Nelia couldn't help but be surprised. She thought Lee Han owed her a debt. Yoner also had the same thoughts as her. A moment later, Professor Euregilm entered the classroom and asked the students to return to their seats and avoid gathering, and Lee Han was also escorted back to his seat. Professor Euregilm walked up to the podium and wanted to know about the students' weekend. But what he cares about is whether the student has completed the magic medicine. Stupid smiles and absent-minded eyes are the current state of the students when mentioning the disastrous weekend, thanks to Professor Euregilm, very true to the saying that cruel people often live carefree lives. Lee Han was a little confused. He seemed to read all their thoughts. Hearing that the student had completed it all made Professor Euregilm unbelievable. Nelia was also dissatisfied with his behavior. Nelia affirmed that the student had cooperated and completed it. Professor Euregilm sighed. He had to accept the method of doing homework as long as he did well. Professor Euregilm spread out a row of experimental bottles in front of the table. Euregilm requested that if he had created a low-level companion spirit potion, this would be the first step to entering alchemy. Professor Euregilm, while pouring the solution, said that his results were just so-so. Then the solution was mixed and poured onto the green soup next to it. A blue gas flew out. Then a blue flame flared up at the top of the tree, but the burning speed was weak. Holding up the small green plant with a burning flame, Euregilm explained that the medicine was too weak to only create a small flame like this. Looking at the burning fire surprised the students. They couldn't believe it could create fire. At the end of the first bottle experiment, Professor Euregilm opened the second bottle to prepare. A blue flame flared up, burning the branch he was holding, illuminating the entire classroom. Professor Euregilm was so surprised by this potion, he could not have expected it. He was curious who the author of this comment was and looked at the note from Lee Han Wodanas. Professor Euregilm was surprised to realize that it was Lee Han. He was suspicious when he saw the professor looking at him with that look. Professor Euregilm looked away, intending to remind Lee Han not to become complacent too soon even if he had prepared a few good potions. Trees to try to disappear. He said that the curriculum will only begin to be difficult later on. Professor Euregilm held out a plump white tome that fit in the palm of his hand. He said today's lesson was learning about spirits. He mentioned that if you want to become an alchemist, you must prepare good magic medicine and also need help from spirits. The students started to stir when they saw the spirit for the first time. Lee Han wondered how spirits all looked like that. Lee Han pulled off his jacket and a white skeleton model appeared. He observed it for a long time. Lee Han understood why no one wanted to learn black magic. Professor Euregilm introduced the ice spirit he often used. Although he was small, he had martial arts. The students were smitten when they saw his cute, chubby appearance. Even though he's a small spirit, this kid can take down the whole class by himself. He just needs to look at life through his nostrils. Lee Han and Yoner began to enjoy the spirit in front of them. He did not forget to remind the students that it was too early to form a contract with this child, so they should try with a low-level spirit first. You cannot immediately make a contract with a high-level spirit, but first need to start with a low-level spirit and build trust, which is important to repeat 3 times. Spirit energy appears in abundance, a jade green color in many different shapes. Professor Uregulm spread his hand while holding a small bag beside him. He said that in places filled with spirit energy, it will be easy to enter the spirit world. He is increasing that source of power. He asked the students to make a plan to become close to a spirit through sincerity and honesty. Yoner began to lick her lips in preparation. Professor Uregulm also reminded that if you approach a spirit with bad intentions, it will detect it and run away. He hopes the students will do well. Having heard him say it for a long time, Li Han now has the view that this is a supplementary class, his most helpful ever. Each student was given a blue potion. He asked the students to drink it. Li Han hesitated for a long time. He still didn't open the lid and kept looking at it. Yoner then obeyed and started drinking. Ashan was a bit hesitant. She raised her hand to adjust her glasses. Li Han opened the lid of the medicine bottle and started drinking. Professor Uregulm smiled. He really wanted to see the student's new image. He wished the student a happy trip. Truly cruel people often live leisurely lives. A moment later, the energy flow transported Li Han, who was still dreaming. Li Han started to wake up and opened his eyes slightly. Li Han was present in the spirit world, covered with snow all year round, rolling mountains and hills. Li Han looked around. He felt like the principal's black book. Now he understood the feeling of entering the spirit world. He remembered that when he woke up in the spirit world, he fell next to a place inhabited by fire spirits and ice spirits, feeling like both were not bad at all. The battle begins. Li Han begins to walk forward. Yoner was extremely excited, exactly what she wanted. Yoner happily recounted her feelings. She couldn't believe it had only been a few seconds in the real world, but she felt like she had been in the spirit world for a long time. Ashan also mentioned the conversation with the carp spirit. Suddenly Professor Uregulm covered his ears. He asked the academy to stop, and if he wanted to talk, he went back to the tower. He wanted the students to improve their abilities, and he mentioned that the students should try to get along with the spirits whenever they had free time. The professor's voice dismissed the class at the end of the period. The students thanked the professor and left. The students left the classroom with laughter and chatter. Li Han was asked by Professor Uregulm to stay. He was a bit worried when asking him about this. He hoped he hadn't made a contract yet. Li Han knew he had noticed, so he could only stay silent. He was nervous when he said he had a big problem. Professor Uregulm burst out laughing when he heard that. He thought this was a true alchemist rookie. He asked him if they didn't listen to him, but the problem was more than that. Li Han pointed at himself nervously. He said everyone gave up when they saw him. He met many spirits, but they all ran away. There were fire dogs, but they all ran right before his eyes. Even pigeons had the same result. He didn't understand why. He was startled when they all ran away. Li Han bowed his head in disappointment. Professor Uregulm stroked the legendary beard. As far as he remembered correctly, he had heard the same thing before. It is the story of a magician who returns to the spirit world after becoming a great magician. That person entered the spirit world more easily thanks to his abilities, but the spirits did not like him. That's because the aura emanating from his soul scared everyone to death. But Li Han wondered why they treated him like that. He assumed it might be because of the mana he possessed. That made his headache worse. His face darkened. Professor Uregulm had some hope that there was a way to solve this problem. He told the ending of the above story. The great magician successfully became close to a spirit. Li Han was curious how to do it. According to his story, Li Han began to imagine the image of that person using magic to tie them up and forcing them to be friends. For Li Han, this method is a bit childish and unworthy of a gentleman when forcing them. Li Han wondered and asked the professor, aren't spirits stronger in the spirit world? He thought for a while before answering. It was true that there was such a small problem. After that, he encouraged Li Han to try harder because maybe this will be very interesting. Li Han also replied silently, yes, but inside he was really confused, but the professor could still speak. From then on, he made up his mind that the next time he went to the professor's cabin, he would steal food. Sienna told her friends, that was Li Han's big problem. After that, the whole group of friends went together. Because there are many cases where spirits are afraid due to misunderstandings, after listening to Sienna, the blue-haired student and Miss Giselle thought, since when is he standing here? I mistook him for someone from the past, our tower. She also added that it also happened in her church. Li Han didn't know if there was any way to avoid it. The church used magical potions, which were similar to the ones we used in class today. Sienna's explanation surprised the other three students. Whoa, some even said, I didn't know it was possible to do that. Sienna said there was a preparation method passed down in the church that was specifically used for spirits, and she had also helped prepare it. If I have enough ingredients, I will make it for you. Anyone who needs it can ask me. Everyone who heard it was excited. But Sienna had a request that this recipe required a lot of ingredients. Then she wrote a few words on a piece of paper. Then show it to everyone. Macon saw that and immediately exclaimed, and he thought to himself that it was too much. So, he immediately asked Sienna, "Is there a way to collect them all?" She immediately answered yes. Then she pondered for a moment and said, "Professor Urigel's research room is located somewhere on the upper floors of the building. There will be all the ingredients listed here. I hope you find a way." From there, Sienna lit up the light with hope, ready to assist him in secretly taking those ingredients. Having finished speaking, he frowned. Everyone now praises and agrees with Sienna's opinion. As expected of Sister Sienna, everyone admires her. He asked cautiously, thanking her for the suggestion, but wasn't it a bit dangerous? Sienna looked at him intently and explained, Lihan of the Wodana's family, a school that supported such methods, was definitely a lesson the professors wanted to convey. He didn't understand how she came to that conclusion. He thought there was nothing more to say. This idea was so attractive. If we got the ingredients, we could use them for other things in the future. If possible, get in large quantities. While he was thinking about something, behind him a small hand tapped on him. When he turned around, it was Nelia. Nelia convinced him to let her come with him. He was stunned because at first he didn't know Nelia was the person who could go with him. Suddenly he shouted, "What is wrong with this school? No matter how many things change, some things remain the same." Then suddenly someone came and attacked him from behind. He gritted his teeth in pain. Then sat down with his face down. For example, this is Professor Volati's class, and he was told that he was not paying attention. Knowing his mistake, he apologized to the professor, but he still couldn't understand how to react when the professor increased the difficulty again. Lihan has a silly face. Where are his interesting lessons? Professor Volati had nothing more to say to him, asking him why he could avoid such difficulties. He thought, clearly the professor could easily penetrate the students' defenses, but the professor didn't even realize that. After pondering for a long time, he came to a different conclusion. The professor could read his thoughts and replied that he understood. Face to face and look at each other, the teacher stops and then we take a break. The teacher explained that Wadanaz knew the reason why he couldn't concentrate in class. He suggested, "You want to recreate the spin like when you defeated the golem, right?" He sighed and thought, "Simply because it's too difficult. Trying too hard will become too late, no need to rush." Suddenly the professor threw something at him. For the first time, put yourself in the student's position to think. What if I were her? Even if I was banned, I would still do it. Because anyone who is afraid and cannot move forward will not have the qualities to be a magician. The professor replied that he understood. He was confused as to why the professor understood. He came closer and knew his temperature was getting hotter. The teacher said something that made him blush, "I will help you concentrate." The answer is very simple. Before he could figure it out, the teacher gave him a blow that he couldn't dodge in time. Suddenly, the professor's magic made him scream, causing him to have his shirt torn on his shoulder. He avoided it, thinking it was just luck. Before he could completely dodge this blow, he suddenly had to dodge more blows that the professor gave him. Too helpless, he used all his strength to control his staff to control the professor's power. The professor was always the one who helped the students in the school. Why now he harmed each of them and he was beaten up, which surprised him, but he had not yet developed his full strength. Li Han was attacked to the point that he was completely drenched and looked very miserable. He looked at Professor Volati and wondered, what the hell is that? Seeing that he was so self-indulgent, even the magic balls were heavier. Oh. Li Han looked at Professor Volati's face and asked in his heart, is the professor planning to attack his student? He bowed down tiredly and continued to think, if it was Professor Volati, it would be possible. Li Han frowned, thinking, everything had come to this. A thought that made him fear that he would have to punish his teacher, but then he thought again. While he was busy thinking, Professor Volati continued to attack. Fortunately, Li Han reacted quickly and dodged the attack. Li Han looked nervously at Professor Volati and thought, although it seems impossible, I have to think of a way to stop him first. He held his wand tightly and decided to take action. Li Han recited the spell, the village flowed, a large source of water gushed out. Professor Volati saw this and wondered, she was trying to increase the number of control water balls. Seeing that, Professor Volody couldn't help but applaud him, but his direction was wrong. Although he was successful, he consumed quite a lot of energy, making him pant. After resting for a while, he stood up. This move is called, the magic shield covers a large water shield that he throws out. This water shield was a second-level magic, it completely embraced Li Han. The magic itself isn't too difficult, but it made Professor Volody very impressed because Wodanis had never learned water shielding. Professor Volody saw this and was pleased that this showed that his potential was great. But that wasn't enough. Professor Volody looked at Li Han and thought, however, once I penetrated, that thin barrier would be useless and continue to attack him. Li Han hummed coldly when faced with Professor Volody's attack. The professor's other ball hit his shield with extremely strong force. He gathered his strength to directly confront Professor Volody's attack. It was unexpected that Li Han could cause Professor Volody's attack to be disabled for him. The professor was quite surprised to see that his move did not cause any damage to the other country's shield. At this moment, the professor saw that the reason Li Han was able to block his attack was because he did not need to control the barrier back and forth like a water bridge, so he only needed to focus on compressing and strengthening the shield. Li Han smiled with satisfaction. Right after that, he immediately returned the blow to Professor Volody. The professor did not react to the attack. He just gently tilted his head to avoid it. Li Han saw that his attack had no effect on the professor at all, so he decided to use the summoning object. Li Han swung it to the ground and ordered it to bite Professor Volody. He knew that wasn't enough, so he looked around looking for more tools. Li Han noticed the table next to him and without hesitation kicked it straight into the table. The table and the summoned object flew towards the professor together, determined to take him down. Unlike his expectations, those two things were completely reused in the air. Professor Volody looked at Li Han and smiled. Li Han saw his smile and was unconsciously scared and sweating. The professor waved his hand around a nearby sphere that emitted red light. The next second the ball started moving. It rushed off the table in an instant. Fly around the professor's body, even flying through the summoned object, causing it to shatter. The professor looked at Li Han with cold eyes. Li Han was stunned and couldn't react. The ball flew straight towards him and penetrated his water shield. His water shield was immediately broken and only then did he regain his senses. Water from the shield kept falling on Li Han's body. Li Han collapsed and the professor calmly walked towards him. Li Han was now completely collapsed at the professor's feet. The professor walked arrogantly looking down from above. At this moment, Li Han could not see clearly what the professor's face looked like. Li Han kept panting and thinking to himself, unable to believe that he had solved everything in just a few seconds. He saw the professor's arm reaching out in fear. He knew right away that what he was doing was just self-defense. But contrary to Li Han's expectations, Professor Volody just gently placed his hand on his shoulder and praised him. Very good. Li Han suddenly glanced at him. After a moment, he was surprised to react. After several months, Li Han's questions were finally answered. Li Han sat in front of Professor Volody and wondered if he liked to push me into a corner to let me reveal my full potential. Li Han thought bitterly, next time it's your turn to do it again. The professor said slowly, wanting to improve your strength is understandable, but one day you will learn, so don't be hasty. The professor also added that sometimes taking a step back is a shortcut, although the professor said that his imagination was very different. Seeing Li Han frozen, the professor spoke to comfort and encourage him. Don't be discouraged, the next class will be about what you just showed. He suddenly replied, yes. He looked at the professor in confusion and wondered, what is the professor talking about? Is it possible that he intends to ignore minor details and do whatever he wants? While he was thinking, the professor deployed magic. The table and chairs Li Han was sitting on began to move, making Li Han fall straight to the ground and scream in pain. He didn't understand anything and asked the professor in panic, what? All tables and chairs were now controlled to fly into the air. Professor Volody explains to him, from now on, we will learn how to concentrate in chaotic situations. After saying that, the professor returned the other objects to their original place, still calmly telling him, you are allowed to do what you did earlier, I will increase the difficulty level if necessary. Hearing that, Li Han could only whisper, please, stop. The sky was covered by darkness. The professor was singing while leisurely going to see his beloved garden. Suddenly behind the wall, he discovered someone hiding behind It turned out to be Li Han, but in the middle of the night, he sat here alone with a haggard face like a ghost, startling the professor. He quickly worriedly asked why he looked half dead like that, but Li Han quickly said it was nothing. It turned out that he looked like a lost soul because Li Han had a difficult class with Professor Volody. Hearing that, he didn't understand why he was so foolish. When Li Han heard that, he asked again, but the professor covered his mouth and said it was nothing. As the two of them walked, the professor asked Li Han if he had any questions while studying here. He also thought for a while. Then he asked the professor a question about whether or not pets were allowed in the school. The professor wondered why he asked that. But Li Han just said he was curious, but maybe he didn't know that white horse was a griffin. The professor also replied that in the academy there is everything from forests, mountains, rivers and lakes to dungeons. If you work hard you will find it. Li Han wondered if he could tame it if he found it, but the professor said it would be difficult, because wild monsters are not easy to tame even by experienced people. He placed some rocks in the stream and considered if that was the case. Then Li Han wants to learn from the professor in his free time. He believes that he can teach him how to tame monsters, and of course his goal is to escape from school. Hearing that Li Han had such a passion for domestication and determination, he couldn't help but be surprised. In response to Li Han's enthusiasm, the professor also agreed to teach him. Their voices still echoed in the quiet forest. Li Han agreed with the professor that he would not regret it even if the class was difficult. The next day, because he didn't sleep the night before, Li Han kept yawning because he was sleepy. He and Yoner started the day by taking a class on basic magic understanding. Yoner saw that he had been drowsy all this time and asked him if he couldn't sleep. Li Han just said he had a nightmare. He told Yoner that in his dream he saw Professor Volody. Li Han was truly obsessed with him. Yoner also understood some of Li Han's hardships, so he patted his shoulder to comfort him. Suddenly the door opened and the professor walked in to start the class. Professor Garcia happily greeted the class, and everyone politely greeted her back. Looking down at the gentle professor in front of him, Li Han felt that at least she did not terrorize him mentally. Hearing Professor Garcia talk about Professor Morton teaching black magic before, all the students were scared and did not want to continue studying that subject. Then she reached out the door and introduced this week's new teacher. A foot slowly walked into the classroom. The professor put his hair in a neat bun, put on a black suit and approached Professor Garcia. She then introduced herself to the students as Professor Millii, who would be another professor teaching them summoning magic. When the students heard there was a new teacher, they were very excited and kept shouting with joy. Professor Millii was also very pleased to see the students welcoming him so warmly. Professor Garcia introduced summoning magic, which they would be taught in second year, but that was what Professor Millii was here for. Suddenly, a few crows outside the window cried so loudly that they drowned out her voice. That's why I didn't have time to hear the reason, but only heard Professor Garcia's final words. Then Professor Millii coughed a few times and started today's class. When she polled the students' interest in summoning magic, many students raised their hands. Li Han looked around and saw that everyone raised their hands, which was probably because summoning magic was very convenient. As far as Li Han knew, there were so many types of summoning magic that it was impossible to know them all. And they even appear in fairy tales. So it means that if you're lucky, you can win a jackpot. Professor Millii feels very happy that many students are interested in this subject. But the next second she asserted that only a few students here could learn it. Professor Millii reminded that this subject is very difficult. If they register for this subject out of curiosity, they will have to struggle. Even though he had not yet studied but had heard the threats, Li Han was also surprised by this upcoming subject. However, Li Han really liked these words. He thinks like that, then he is truly a professor, and other people cannot understand these profound words. Recalling the image of Professor Volody always threatening him with life and death matters, he saw him more like a thug. Professor Millii said that summoning magic involves many other fields, so to be successful, knowledge must be comprehensive. Even summoning things that are not living things is very difficult. Once again, she advised students to stop if they only participated out of curiosity. When other students heard that, they also decided to give it a try. Seeing that despite all my advice, everyone still maintained their decision, she sighed and gave up. Professor Garcia stood up and asked Professor Millii to give the students a chance because they were all very talented. She finally agreed and then used her stick to tap the air a few times. A series of scrolls appeared in front of each student. On that magic scroll was engraved a magic circle symbol. Yoner held the scroll in his hand very excitedly because it was not the disposable type that was torn in half. Li-han also realized that this was a normal scroll drawing a magic circle. She asked the students if they were studying basic geometry and arithmetic. The students sadly admitted when they heard about it. Li-han saw that the classroom atmosphere had become gloomy. There were indeed some students who were not good with numbers. But even so, he still found it much easier to study here. Guy Nandu next door had not yet studied and felt discouraged. Hearing the mention of calculations and the students were out of energy, Professor Miliai said that there was no way they could use summoning magic. She asked the students to pay attention during that class because drawing a magic circle also required calculation. Then the professor told them to draw a circle in their heads. Before practicing, Li-han picked up the scroll to examine. He looked closely at the magic circle before his eyes. It resembles a type of circuit board. The flow of mana in it is similar to the current in a microelectronic board. The higher the level and difficulty of the magic, the more complex it is. The magic circle was born to help with these things. These are amplification, reduction, bypass, containment and many other things. To circulate mana, there are countless different formulas to reduce the burden on magicians. After thinking for a while, Li-han has grasped how mana circulates. Suddenly a memory flashed across his head, making him remember something. It was nothing else but a quill pen. Opening his eyes, he wondered why he remembered that thing, while Professor Miliai was still introducing the magic circle. She held a quill and said that was the magic that summoned this thing. Hearing the magic that summoned goose feathers, Li-han also thought of something. After that, Li-han also knew why he remembered them. When he had conveyed all the knowledge, Professor Miliai asked the students to start practicing. The students all chanted spells, waved their arms and legs, and did everything they could to summon a quill. Suddenly, a ray of blue light shined directly on the paper. Then the paper exploded like a firework, only to see a bright blue light that blinded the students' eyes. They realized that even high-level magic scrolls would be damaged if abused too much, so the professor immediately gave them new ones to continue practicing. Right where Adenart was sitting, a blue light appeared, causing everyone around to pay attention to the princess. From the princess's hand that successfully summoned the quill, the other students also summoned the same thing. When everyone could do it, the students burst into laughter. Even Professor Garcia below was speechless, thinking that they shouldn't be satisfied with just summoning the same thing. It's the meticulous attention to detail that makes summoning such a difficult subject. Summoning the same thing means failure, unless everything is perfect, otherwise it's meaningless. In creating that requires a magician's will, Ashan was currently struggling with the quill that refused to listen to him. There was a slight possibility that it would attack the summoning magician, but Guy Nandu was repeatedly hit on the head with a quill. Ashan was not yet proficient in controlling the quill, causing it to move wildly, attacking Guy Nandu to the point that he held his head in tears and scolded him. Being overwhelmed by the situation, Guy Nandu told Li-han that someone was intentionally trying to kill him. Li-han was too familiar with this game, so he calmly told him to be quiet. He was still focusing on summoning his quill. Seeing that Li-han had not yet summoned the brush, Enrogo couldn't help but feel pleased. He has such an attitude because he has summoned a complete brush. Then he glanced at the other student, confidently thinking that no one else could do better than him. Enrogo put his hands down on the table and stood up, intending to show off to the arrogant Tan Dragon crowd. He went to Li-han and teased him when he still couldn't summon him. However, Li-han only saw Enrogo's words as the wind blowing through the clouds, so he remained silent and did not respond. When he saw that he was being given a huge lump of butter, he bitterly told Li-han to look here. Yoner saw that and said that he didn't have a brush at home. Why did he have to scream like that? Enrogo wanted Li-han to look at the brush he summoned, but he still didn't care and picked up the stick. Then Li-han concentrated on chanting the spell. Then he ordered the brush to appear, and around his body began to emit blue light. Suddenly Li-han's paper flew up and moved back and forth, just like a naughty boy. Then in front of him, strips of blue light emitted from the paper everywhere. The symbol engraved on the paper still radiates strong streams of light. The paper just glowed without any change, and nothing appeared. Right now you're a little disappointed thinking you failed. Suddenly from outside the window, an extremely strong light shined in. It seemed that Li-han had just been shocked, so he fell to the ground and lay motionless. Yoner saw everything happening in the blink of an eye, then turned around and stammered to ask what was going on. Enrogo said it sounded like something had exploded, but Li-han didn't seem to care too much, because now he had successfully summoned the brush. The shocking thing was that he summoned not just one pen but countless pens. Quills fell from above and fell all over the classroom, making the students bewildered at this rare sight. Everyone was amazed at the scene before their eyes. They thought it was Li Han who summoned them all. Hearing that Li Han surpassed them, he also did not accept the truth. Then Li Han held in his hand one of the feather pens he summoned. Even he found it difficult to control the abundant mana he possessed. He secretly thought that he shouldn't overdo things like this. Li Han thought that he had used too much energy, so the scroll must have been abused to the point where it could no longer be used. But surprisingly, it remained unharmed and completely normal. Li Han wondered if there was really such a thing as a scroll so strong that it could withstand this much. Li Han did not expect that his ability to control mana was better than he thought, all thanks to the special training course with Professor Volity. A feather pen landed right in Professor Garcia's hand. She held the feather pen in her hand with a very satisfied expression. Professor Garcia then looked towards Professor Millii and thought that it was very difficult to summon just one meeting, but to be able to get so many, Professor Millii must be very proud of Li Han. But in complete contrast, she had an uncomfortable frown on her face, dissatisfied with what he had just done. She immediately stepped forward to relieve Li Han, saying that because he had too much mana, this was understandable, but Professor Millii still did not agree. She said that this was not a mistake. Professor Garcia heard that and asked in surprise. Professor Millii looked at Li Han and had to admit that he was very talented, but there was a problem. The next second, she raised her glasses with a stern expression, judging him to be too arrogant. She then said that Li Han summoning so many brushes was because of arrogance. Professor Garcia defended him and said that was not the case. Professor Millii saw her keep defending her students and glanced at her with sharp eyes. Seeing that, Professor Garcia was a little hesitant and laughed it off. On the professor's side, there is also a hierarchy, which is even more accurate when a professor was once a student of another professor. It turned out that Professor Millii had once been her professor. She reminded her that it was good to care for her students, but she had to teach them their behavior. She had no other choice but to obey. Seeing that Professor Garcia seemed uneasy, she looked at her for a moment. Then he reassured her and told her there was nothing to worry about. Professor Millii looked at the students and said there were many ways to treat arrogance. Li Han also retaliated against Enrogo for teasing him before by writing on his face while he was extremely resistant. Then the whole class was in an uproar. Some said they had to protect Einrogard, some said stop. The confused professor standing below could only ask the students to calm down. Then she asked the class to be quiet so the lesson could continue. At this time, the students had stabilized their positions and were no longer noisy. Professor Millii continued to say that through today's class, they will learn that many things are not as easy as they imagine. Even though the students found it difficult, she still said that today's lesson was basic. Usually they had to do this without scrolls. She looked towards Li Han and added that if anyone wants to continue, go to her class. Many people believe that the most important thing when learning magic is talent. At this moment, Li Han also felt like she was looking at him. Professor Millii continued, the most important thing is patience and perseverance. She said the important thing twice. She pushed up her glasses and said the most important thing was patience and perseverance. At this time it was dark. Li Han and Guy Nandu were in the dark building. At Guy Nandu's feet were full of potion bottles and strange-looking bones. He felt that this gloomy place should be made a little more pleasant. The reason Li Han gave was that these subjects were not important, let alone the two of them were interested. As soon as they finished speaking, they both had to stop when they saw someone standing in front of them. In front of them were two other students, one kneeling and the other standing in front of the gate. The two people turned to look at them, but due to the gloomy space, they couldn't see their faces clearly. Li Han was also surprised that there were still other students because he thought it was supposed to be just them, but there were two more students. Guy Nandu saw that sudden appearance and frantically asked why those people came here to study. Li Han asked him back why he hated this subject so much. He then argued that it was because Professor Millii said he had talent, but Li Han thought that Guy Nandu hated dark magic. The two people's conversation shocked the others, causing them to come over and say that they were both really noisy. Standing in front of Li Han was a very classy and polite student who quickly recognized him as the infamous Wardanas. On his serious face, perhaps the highlight is those golden eyes. The closer you look at those yellow eyes, the more fascinated you become. Li Han guessed that he must have come from the White Tiger Tower. His yellow eyes and strange aura attracted his attention. Li Han looked closely for a while and seemed to notice something. Maybe he was a Nephilim, a descendant of fallen angels and humans. Laftel arrogantly thinks that even a sinner like Li Han can recognize the blood of his great ancestors flowing in him. However, Li Han did not appreciate him very much because even though he was a half-celestial bloodline, Laftel's blood was not as pure as Digiling's. And even though Laftel appears to be a natural enemy to Li Han, he doesn't look like the type of person who would follow Giselle. Li Han thought he should take advantage of this opportunity to give the White Tiger Tower a shock, so he asked a noble person like him why he worked for Marathi. To Li Han's surprise, he objected and told him not to misunderstand. Because an arrogant person like Laftel absolutely did not listen to Marathi, he was upset when Li Han seemed to intentionally insult him. Face to face, Li Han wanted to know why if he didn't work for Marathi, why did he have a trash personality, but what he meant was that he was stoned. And that's not what Li Han meant. What he meant was why Laftel was hostile towards him. Guy Nandu on the other side also saw Li Han trying to brace himself and stammering. Not knowing, he asked, but Laftel thought Li Han was pretending to be a bewildered golden deer and angrily pointed at him. The reason he was hostile towards him was all because Gyu, Laftel's respected friend, had his honor insulted by Li Han. It turned out that it was because of great friendship. At this time, Li Han also understood, but he also gave up on such a reason. When Guy Nandu heard about this, he suddenly realized that perhaps he was from the Graal family. The Graal family, which is a family of knights from the south, is very proud of their angelic blood and is also one of the families that worships justice the most. Laftel also admitted that he was from the Graal family, but what Guy Nandu wondered was why he learned dark magic, when that family was famous for its knights. He looked disdainful when student Tan Long also needed to explain some basic things. He learned to kill dark magicians faster. Li Han thought that if the professor heard these words, he would cry. I was talking to Laftel all this time and forgot there was another student there. Guy Nandu looked that way and asked why he was learning dark magic. Suddenly that tall student stood up and made Guy Nandu completely startled. She was like a big bear. Guy Nandu only stood close to her shoulder. Guy Nandu smelled danger and immediately trembled and hid behind Li Han. He was also impressed by the other student's height. Li Han thinks that she possesses such outstanding height because she probably possesses half of the bloodline of a giant. But the interface was one thing and the operating system was another. She turned around and politely introduced herself as Immerg. Nice to meet them. Just met, but Immerg was very friendly, saying that he liked dark magic so he came here, hoping to get close to them, but Laftel stood to the side and seemed to refuse. In response to this kindness, Li Han also hopes that everyone can get along. He also changes his opinion about her. It is true that he cannot imagine her by looking at her face. She was happy to hear that Li Han also wanted to get along and the two gave each other their first handshake. However, the joy of having new friends didn't last long when something seemed to happen. After that, Li Han was stunned. It turned out that Immerg was shaking hands, but accidentally used too much force, causing Li Han's hands to tremble and turn red. Li Han just saved my life. If he hadn't injected mana, she would have broken her bones. She's really strong. After Li Han, Guy Nandu was also very happy. When he met Immerg and wanted to shake hands, Li Han stopped him. But it was too late. Guy Nandu's hand was probably broken by that terrible strength. It was time to get down to studying. Seeing the students arriving, Professor Morton invited them in. Seeing that there were quite a few people coming, he was also very happy because he did not expect so many students to be interested in this subject. Looking at Laftel expectantly, Professor Morton said that he seemed particularly excited. Laftel also agreed without hesitation. As expected, Guy Nandu's hand was gone. Li Han helped him give him first aid, but he still felt sorry for the professor. The new students also hoped he would take care of them. Then Professor Morton told them to stand behind the table he had prepared. More importantly, the professor asked Li Han if he had found the summoning bone. He replied that he had not found it yet. Hearing that, the professor winked and suggested that he try going to strange and dark places to find out. Although the suggestion sounded very unusual, Li Han still reluctantly agreed. Professor Morton asked everyone about the previous lesson and said that today they would first improve their understanding of the curse. Guy Nandu quickly said that cursing was much more fun than summoning, so the professor who was explaining the concept immediately stopped hearing that. Then he turned to ask if he had learned summoning. Guy Nandu calmly confirmed. Suddenly, he asked with a dark face how the other students reacted. Guy Nandu quickly said that they all liked it. Everyone else came to the classroom today, and Li Han sitting next to him was also speechless. The professor's mood after listening was gloomy and not very happy. Then, his hand placed on the books and said today. Then the professor, looking up, decided to teach them how to summon undead instead of learning curse spells. When everyone heard that, they were very excited. Only Li Han was skeptical and wondered if it was okay. Because he realized, they had leapfrogged countless knowledge already. Professor Morton said that summoning undead was the core and most basic thing. Lavthil immediately had a question. He asked if it wasn't necessary to summon the undead. Professor Morton saw that and immediately replied, "It's true that in the past, there were some dark magicians who still enjoyed digging up graves even though they knew it was taboo." Hearing that, Lavthil continued to say that if it was a taboo, magicians would still dig up graves. Right, he did not hesitate to answer, there are indeed people like that. Li Han next to him wondered if Lavthil knew what he was saying, what not. And then, he said that he would not force the class to summon complete undead because he knew they would lose control. Morton's cold face slowly turned around, scaring them that they were probably going to visit their grandparents. Li Han was confused why they had to do this. Guy Nandu heard that he could pay homage to his grandparents and he told about how he almost died because of a magic brush. Starting the lesson, he said, the first thing would be the hands. The magic begins to be performed. Li Han was still looking very attentively. A cloud of black smoke gathered on each person's table. Everyone was surprised because a magic circle appeared on their table. The summoned object appeared, a bone hand emerged from the magic circle, it wiggled its hand. Flex your bones and joints, straighten your arms on the table. And then, it appeared on the table, everyone was surprised. After finishing casting the magic, the professor mentioned that everyone wants to learn the summoning because it's cool and great, but it's not that simple to learn. It remains to be considered whether it is a normal monster or more difficult to control factors if summoning an undead monster. And that's why they need special methods to approach death. So they couldn't perform magic yet, now they just needed to try to approach the hand using any method they could think of. Guy Nandu starts with light touching first to see how it goes. Li Han pondered for a moment. He asked the professor a question, asking if there were undead monsters that were easily frightened. He replied that there would be no because they weren't creatures so they didn't know what fear was. Before he could finish his sentence, his eyes opened wide. Opened very, very loudly and was surprised. The summoned object was trembling. It trembled, right in front of Li Han too. The professor was worried why it was behaving like that. He wondered if there was a problem with the medicine he was using. Turning to Guy Nandu, seeing him being attacked by it on his face causing swelling, I thought it was not normal because of the drug. He immediately had an idea, maybe it was. Then call Li Han in. Please try summoning one yourself. He hesitantly asked if he could do it, but the professor still confidently said of course. He threw a small bone to Li Han, explaining that the strength of a black magician is that the training can be adjusted. After listening, Li Han secretly thought that this was improvisation rather than self-adjustment. The object in his hand placed one end on the wooden floor. The magic bracelet appeared again, right under his feet, and he told him to chant the spell. He sighed, no matter where he goes. He threw the small bone his grandfather had given him into the circle. A flood of incantations was recited by him. He shouted, commanding the skeletal hand to rise, the wand to glow. Everyone's faces were tense. Black smoke circled around the stick. The professor looked at him attentively. Then, the black mass of magic headed straight towards the small bone. It started to glow. A skeletal hand is summoned. He was so worried that he was sweating. The skeletal hand is gradually perfected. It lowered its fingers. It still stood there right in front of him. Li Han looked at it and wondered if he had succeeded yet. Then he got worried and turned to the professor and saw that he was still silent. And he stared at the skeletal hand. His eyes darkly focused on it. This summoning magic is actually a chain that controls the summoned monster, that's why novice magicians can't summon, Morton thought to himself. He clenched his fist, magic could be unleashed at any time if the skeletal hand attacked Li Han. The skeletal hand continued to move. He was secretly surprised and afraid why it reacted without any command. He immediately blocked Li Han's body, preparing to cancel its summon. Its 5 fingers stretched out. It did not attack but fell to the ground in front of the surprise of the two of them. It lay on the ground trembling. Both looked at it without understanding. Outside the building. In the professor's room, he explained that the incident just happened because he had too much mana. He wanted to reduce them, but he stopped him. That was his natural talent. He gave advice: from now on you don't need to approach the undead monsters, you just need to make them subdue by force. Li-han also thanked him and thought the teacher wouldn't be of much help. Suddenly there was a scream from behind. That was Guy Nandu. He was beaten by a bone hand, his beautiful face was swollen, he decided to risk his life on it. He was so angry that his head was about to explode. Li-han has nothing more to say. Compared to the rest, isn't Guy Nandu talented in this field? The professor also said, talented, but he hasn't developed his full strength yet, of himself. After a while the three friends finally left the professor's room. Guy Nandu's face was still swollen. As he walked, he blamed the zombies for not having any noble character. After applying the medicine, Guy Nandu with a swollen face told Li-han to come with him to the summoning class, as long as he wasn't a zombie. After listening, Li-han did not answer but began to wonder if he was sure, because most of the summoned creatures, including spirits, were ferocious, because they were usually monsters or demons. Behind him, the magician student looked at the two people side by side and couldn't help but curse under his breath. Damn the black magician, all his actions just now made him pin him. He angrily pointed at his swollen face on one side and wondered why Li-han dared to slap him. That reproachful statement made Li-han turn around and explain that he had just accidentally done it, but the magician student didn't believe it and continued to grumble. Would earlier, during class. Not only summoning, Li-han also wanted to test what orders he could give. To what extent? In the classroom, Li-han had a control staff in his hand, causing something to crumble. The professor next to him was shocked, excited when he saw that he had successfully let it self-destruct. The mage student holding a bone hand heard that and glanced at him. He approached where Li-han was sitting and spoke ill of him as an evil bastard. After his words, the bone leg on Li-han's body began to move. Without Li-han having time to say a word, that bone leg flew straight towards a certain direction. It fell and landed perfectly on the ground. When the magician students saw it, they were alert. That bone leg flew into the air, and the magician students were bewildered when they saw that. Before he could realize anything, that bone leg slapped him straight in the face. After that slap, a dark aura enveloped the entire building.